Now, the Prime Minister's comments followed the passing of a compendium of financial bills in the lower chamber last evening. Wrapping up debate on a repeal of the Central Bank and the Banks and Trust Companies Regulation Acts and the Protection of Depositors Amendment Act was Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, the Honourable K. Peter Turnquist, who sought to clarify any lingering questions concerning the proposed pieces of legislation.
Recognizes that the liabilities of a bank poses a systemic risk to the jurisdiction and to the government as a result. And we know that there is one bank in particular who has had a challenge that has caused the government to have to step in with a significant amount of money to support its operations, meaning that it is a significant risk to the jurisdiction and to the government. In the event that something like that happens again, we want to be in a position to address those challenges. And so in the bill itself, it talks about this whole administration process. But in addition to that, the fee structure recognizes that the overall cost of that domestically systemic important institution poses a risk, and therefore the cost of managing or supervising that institution is more than it would be for, say, a bank that does not have a domestic operation. And the fee thus recognizes that additional cost.
Turnquist also using the opportunity to again defend international credit rating Moody's decision to downgrade the Bahamas by 2 notches.
He makes it clear in their discussion that the issues that affect their rating assessment has nothing to do with the government's management of the fiscal affairs of the country. In fact, they actually give us credit for what we have done. What it does reflect, however, is the vulnerable nature of our economy. That is, being primarily tourism dependent. And if you were to look at all of the ratings around tourism dependent countries, whether in the region or further afield, you will see that the ratings are actually worse than ours. So in our peer group, we're actually on par or just a little bit better than most of them, quite frankly.
Well, just before their passing, this suite of legislation got the nod from St. Anne's Member of Parliament, Brent Simonet, who reminded that they were all passed 20 years ago at the height of the global economic crisis.
The Central Bank Act and the Bank and Trust Company has its basis in those three pieces of legislation that were passed back then. The tweaking that has gone on, as a member of East Grand Bahama said, was with regard to things like the sand dollar, electronic banking, bringing in the credit unions into that. Because over time, a number of institutions have grown up in the Bahamas as money lending institutions, which are not governed by the Central Bank Act. You go on the radio and you hear, if you just bring in your electric bill, we'll give you a $10,000 advance. So there are quite a number of institutions that are below this level of requirement, which do not afford the borrower, if I can use that word, the borrower, the protection that is provided for under the Bank and Trust Companies Act.
He also spoke to the whole issue of modernizing the country's business model.
I think if we check the records, the majority of accounts, not the size, the majority of accounts in the Bahamas probably never peak above $25,000 in transactions in their accounts. You take the minimum wage is what, $208 a week. So most accounts in banks probably never peak above 25,000. So I think it's time that we could possibly move to lessening the requirements for those persons to bring their birth certificate and their passport and their grandmother's passport and all this other issue, and delegate downwards the discretion to the banks to deal with the KYC.
Well, Elizabeth member Dr. Duane Sands also throwing his support behind the legislation. Here's what he had to say.
If you look at the external reserves of the Commonwealth of the Bahamas for the last 10 years, April of 2020 was the highest at $2 billion that our external reserves have been in the last 10 years. And as of the end of May 2020, they stood at $1.97 billion. And so, Mr. Speaker, for Bahamians who are concerned about the impact of COVID-19 and whether or not we are about to be downgraded or our dollar devalued, it is so important for us to upgrade the ability of the central bank to perform the very important regulatory functions that it does, so that they can keep their eye on the ball, so that we can make sure that this economy is able to take the buffeting and the beating that could possibly occur over the next months and years.
Meantime, opposition leader and member of parliament for Cat Island, Rumkey and San Salvador, Philip Davis, shared words of caution on the legislation and a claim of insufficient notice to debate.
The integrity of this institution becomes questionable when we are engaged in a process that neither of us could speak to in an intelligent way and appreciate what transformational efforts are being engaged in here. But we found out these bills, as a compendium, was laid during the budget debate. How many of us paid attention to when it was made?